Hello, and welcome back to another review by me, your humble narrator, Matt. And this is, of course, took a long time to get here, which is unfortunate because this book is yet another one. Really is a huge eye opener, and I read it in the context of my senior year English class, post-colonial literature. Once again, that was taught by Mr. David Gamble. And how you doing? And so, yes, I really wanted to top this segment of my reviews off with that book because between that and we of course read several books, but the ones that really influenced me the most were the Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, uh, The Joys of Motherhood by Bushi Yamashita, and Weep Not Child by Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o, who apparently, as I just learned, he went by James Thiong'o. That was his nom de plume when he first published the book, and it was his debut novel. In fact, it was published in 1964, and it gives us a beautiful look at the culture of Kenya. The two previous books were talking about Nigeria, and really, yeah, they dealt with, they give a pretty good coverage of like pre-colonial life versus post-colonial life, or rather, the colonial period. And then they touched on what post-colonial life was, the aspirations of it. Weep Not Child deals again with the colonial period in Kenya, and it talks about basically what life was like in the post-war period, the emergence of the Mau Mau movement, which was, of course, branded as a terrorist movement in its time by Western media, but was in fact, yes, they were a liberation movement that emerged in Kenya because, as a settler colony, much like South Africa, yes, the government's response, the British government and the colonial government there, their response to the independence movement was repression and violence. And so Mau Mau, yes, they naturally were radicalized, and so they fought rather ruthlessly against this. And of course, in time, all of the torturous methods and uh, just um, crimes against humanity, right? That came out. And that was something that, the British government and all those who were involved in the colonial government there, they were very much, they had a really hard time explaining this. It's like, yeah, you're a war criminal, or rather, this wasn't even a war. You just committed crimes against humanity. And yeah, recently saw there was an interview with someone who was part of the police at the time, and he couldn't answer those questions there because, of course, you could see in his eyes when he was asked about this. It's like, yeah, basically, I did horrible, horrible, inhuman things, and I'm a criminal. I'm a monster by any definition. Anywho, in fact, yeah, and I believe Mr. Gamble actually told us from memory how Mau Mau was portrayed by the media, and that's really how I came to know this. And yeah, subsequent learning on my part confirmed that. Yeah, they were called very much. They were called a terrorist movement. Anyway, this story covers that in part, but it is a very sad story, and it really encapsulates Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o's whole mentality, right? And that evolved somewhat. And we also got to read a wonderful essay by him. In fact, actually, I think it was called Decolonizing the Mind. Yeah, a very, very important title there, and something that did stick with me, that very concept, right? Yeah, I'm embarrassed I forgot that for a moment. But yeah, so to give a little bit of a little explanation about that, decolonizing mind, he was talking about post-colonial Kenya and other African countries, and he was writing this as a basically an exile or an emigre who was living in Britain and who was writing, rather scathing things about Kenya's current government, and just the failure of a lot of the post-colonial regimes and the dream of it. And he basically said that yes, African nations that they have dictators in charge who have sold out their country to their former colonial masters, right? In exchange for backing from Britain, the United States, and France, others, in exchange for that kind of for financial support and diplomatic recognition, they basically would let foreign companies just suck up the resources for their own benefit, as long as they got their cut. And as I know from my mentor, who I've mentioned many times here, Kashimoto Ngũgĩ, full name. As I learned from him, Zaire and its dictator Mobutu Sese Seko, he set the standard for it. Kleptocracy was his whole thing. He would he would neglect his own people and let companies do whatever they wanted, and as he would skim off the top, they would look the other way, and he'd put all this money in his bank account. Yeah, I think I do believe Kashimoto told me he'd accrued like $6 billion over time, and that was shortly before he was overthrown and died in exile. Yeah, which happened. It was that happened in I think 1998, and I was there to talk about Kashimoto about that, and he was quite happy seeing that dictatorship overthrown. So Kenya's struggle, on the other hand, Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o is portraying this. He's showing what in his debut novel, just sort of the transition between a period where an independence movement was emerging peacefully, and then how that went, how the repression and brutality of the white settlers and the British government it led to radicalization, and it affects a family in the story, which includes Njoroge, and his father, a man named Ngotho, is a well-respected and somewhat wealthy individual who is a custodian of the land. He does this job for a collaborator, basically, one of the many individuals who were selected by the British government to own land and be part of the elite as a way of keeping the population large down. And so, yes, Ngotho works for the man named Jacobo. And yes, he was made rich by his dealings with the white settlers, which in the story includes Mr. Howlands, who is kind of the big man in the area there. He is the guy who owns just about everything. And the story also it shows also how people from South Asia were brought into this colony, as well as many others, to act as the middle class, right? Because aside from the token collaborators, they did not want any Africans occupying positions where they could accrue wealth, influence, and of course education. However, during the interwar years, and this is something I mentioned there too, because of course the other books in the series they touch on this. In the interwar years, the British government was doing something progressive for a change. After World War One, between World War One and World War Two, they began building public education schools and universities all across the continent because they understood the British Empire is fallen apart. And the French did much the same. They understood that it's like we're going broke after the First World War, and the Second World War really only added to that, right? It's like the empire cannot survive, so we are basically and again in a very imperialist mindset, right? We're educating these people so they can handle their own affairs once we grant them independence. But of course, after World War II, the colonial powers they did not let go of most of their colonies. You had a few instances where, like in India, that was done by 1945, thereabouts anyway. But the British government did hold on to many of its colonies, including Kenya, Mainly because, yeah, there were white settlers there, and also the Cold War really drove Britain, the United States, and the other Western powers into a very deeply conservative position with regards to their colonies. And so basically, yeah, they were repressive and ugly and uh, I'd say irredeemably bad. And this was something that, yeah, the other side in the Cold War, the Soviets, they had a good time with. They assisted independence movements, while also, of course, repressing them at home and within their own imperial domain. But yeah, it didn't go so well for the imperialists, right? As I believe I've said before, the Europeans did not lose a single colonial war during their invasion of Africa, but by the 1960s and for some countries shortly thereafter, they lost every single colonial war. They did not prevail once because, of course, it's a losing fight. So, getting into the story, it's divided into two parts. In the first part, we see the main character, Njoroge, and how he's going to school, he's getting an education. He's part of this post-war generation that benefited from all these, these progressive reforms, these temporary attitude of preparing the country for independence. So his family's got a lot of hope for him. It's like he's going to become part of the next generation of Africans who are leading the country, um, who are becoming the leaders of the country. So, picking up where I left off there, so we then follow Njoroge to school. We see him go from public school into boarding school, where he gets to meet white kids, and I do believe that includes the son of Mr. Howlands. So Njoroge actually has sort of complicated relationships in the story. He is best friends with Jacobo's daughter, and they're quite close, and they become separated later on by circumstances. But yeah, I don't know for sure that he meets the son of Mr. Howlands there. I just remember very distinctly how while he's at boarding school, he got a chance. He met some kid who of significance, and they're sitting down together and they're talking and they're realizing, all the stuff they have in common and how at this point there's tensions and so forth happening in their at home, and how they're not happy about it, and yeah, and really how they're on the same page, even though they're coming from very, very different backgrounds. And so, meanwhile, we learned in part one still, the father he reluctantly joins a general strike. Right? There's the Kenyan people are the local people, I should say. They decide to have a general strike in order to protest wages and conditions. So they want better treatment, and so yeah, this is what kind of tips things off. During the strike, the Mr. Hollins is there demanding that people, return to work, return to their homes. Jacobo is brought out to try and talk them into this, but people aren't hearing it, and I believe they throw something at him or whatever. Things start to get violent, and from that point onward, it's like crackdown, crackdown, crackdown. And Jacobo and Mr. Howlands, right, they're basically at war with the locals who are resisting. And Njoroge's oldest brother, he goes off to join Mao Mao. So now his family is very, very invested in this. And I also recall his father then, as a result of his involvement, he loses everything. And he is deeply distraught, and he has this moment where it's like, why did this happen? And he answers to himself. He says, it's because you are a coward. Sir, you are a coward. And yeah, it's like he is basically coming to terms with the fact that, yeah, all along he was following the system, going along with it. He was very hesitant to do anything about it, to fight for change, and he's blaming himself for the whole thing now, rather unfairly. And so then, yes, Georgie, he continues to do his schooling. He gets into university, but things really go awry because of the rebellion back home. And his brother, I do believe, by the end of the story, has killed Jacobo, the collaborator, and Ndroje himself is nabbed and brought to Mr. Howland's, where they are beating him and torturing him, demanding to know where his brother is, right, what they're up to, and so forth. And this is where his education pretty much ends. He's now unable to return to school. He's forced to find employment locally. And Jacobo's daughter, he reconnects with her, and she too, she's dealing with a lot of hardship, and they're talking about this, and I remember the scene too because they're asking the question, why is this happening? What's going on? And yeah, the daughter, she says that, well, it's you know how God is. One man sins, everybody suffers, and they're sort of just commiserating about that. And the story ends with Njoche. He is now working for an Indian merchant, and he is very much distraught and lost at this point there because Jacobo's death at the hands of his brother means that he and his best friend, his daughter, are now completely separated. So he's no longer able to pursue his education. His future is completely in doubt, and yeah, he's basically lost everything. And then he is during his job, right? Given that he's so distraught and given that he's so just downtrodden, he's unable to do it effectively, and the customer is offended by him, a white customer, and then so his boss says, "You're fired," and he attempts to hang himself. But his family intervenes, luckily, and he's brought home, and they're looking after him, and he has a very similar moment to what his father experienced. It's like, why did all of this happen? Because you are a coward. And a very, very sad ending there. But yeah, during part two, I should mention, this is all during part two. And yeah, the Mau Mau Rebellion is in full swing, and that's why there's, of course, this big clampdown, and families are being rounded up, interrogated, and arrested because of suspected or known involvement by family members. And yeah, so they're really, it's like there's a little bit of justice, it seems like Jacobo was killed. But yeah, this is no happy ending whatsoever, and it's very much deliberate. And Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o was very much he was a Marxist at heart, so speaking to the whole, post-colonial struggle and how the Soviets were assisting, in this there. But yeah, Marxism had become very much a part of the colonial experience, right? And this is precisely why you saw communist revolutions happening in various colonies, not the least of which was Vietnam and Cambodia. And um, groping for examples here. Well, yes, many African regimes. In fact, Kenya, its post-colonial government, and that of Ethiopia, they renamed the country. It was Abyssinia, and they renamed it Ethiopia. That you had Marxist governments take power, and they were much like all other Marxist governments, just like the Ba'athist the governments of the Middle East, right? Who also followed the whole Marxist principles. The state controls the industry, and yeah, represses the people, and enforces a code of education on them that says this is the right way to think, this is our struggle, this is that there. But of course, don't question, criticize the government ever. Don't be disloyal. Yeah, and that was the case for Kenya. That which was it was of course different than the many many regimes that were kleptocrats. So yeah, um, and that of course this was generally what happened with post-colonial governments in Africa. Just the swing back and forth between various governments, military coups and controls, right? Um, and yeah, and otherwise, several populist leaders who ended up becoming just either dictators or yeah, kleptocrats who just were looking out for themselves. And yes, Ngũgĩ was one of many African intellectuals raised in the post-war period who had to then leave because their governments were being such, tyrants, and they didn't much like the intelligentsia saying that they were failures and liars and murderers and cowards and sellouts and so forth, as you can imagine. And so, yes, Mr. Gamble actually did a very good comparison, right? And we then studied this as it's like in terms of post-colonial African thought in literature, right? There was this debate. There were these camps about how do we proceed from here, right? And whereas Chinua Achebe was a sort of an inclusive thinker, an experimentalist, I think it was called experimentalist, and inclusionist, something like that. Yeah, whereas he said that, yeah, we need to accept each other and our cultural backgrounds, and Africa needs to proceed with, both our own ways and the European model, right? We'll figure that out. Whereas, yeah, Ngũgĩ, Mr. Gamble said this, his words, was like, bullshit. And yeah, basically saying that colonialism deprived us of so much, and now we're still operating based on the same colonial mindset. Hence the title of his essay. But yeah, he basically felt that, yeah, we're still operating with all of the crap that the Europeans enforced on us, that we're lesser than, that we need to be like them in order to see to our own affairs and so forth, and that the behavior, the practice of the independent governments and Africans in their independence era, the practices still mirrored that of the colonial period, right? Which is to say, we're exporting our resources there. That's really our only economy, thanks to the colonists. We're exporting our resources, and we're allowing others to pillage our land, and we're just, yeah, and that especially with the case of the ruling elites, we're doing this because we're the new collaborators, and this is neo-colonialism, as many called it. And so, yeah, in terms of in terms of how invested or how much I like this book, I did not enjoy it as much as Chinua Achebe or Buchi Machida, and it wasn't because it had a sad ending. Those other books had pretty sad endings, very very telling endings. But yeah, his writing style it didn't quite grip me the same way. I mean, both yeah, Akibe and Emachida, they really sort of drew you in and really painted a picture of the culture. Yeah, Thiong'o, it was no less a genius. Is very brilliant guy, had some very brilliant thoughts, and yeah, and what he demonstrated, what he illustrated about Kenya there. I mean, that certainly made an impression. I still remember the book, and it's sort of key scenes very very well. So I highly recommend it. I would recommend this as well as the previous post-colonial books I mentioned, and for anyone who's really looking to have their eyes open, because it's like it is amazing how little we know about African history, the colonial era, the post-colonial era. It was something I felt so grateful for to be educated on, because it's like there's this huge gap in my knowledge about that. And so, yeah, it was very cool to get into that. And some of my other courses there too, the senior level history courses, those were especially good when they dealt with this era and what the Europeans were doing. Yeah, and it really, really, really opened my eyes and set me on a good course there, because by university, we were studying this. I was taking history courses. We were studying this, and I felt well prepared. And so, yeah, I mean, I hats off to not only David Gamble, but many of the teachers I had in my senior year who were teaching us university level stuff. And that was because, of course, back in that day, there was still such a thing as grade 13 in Ontario, or Ontario Academic Credits, OAC, which makes me sad that it doesn't exist anymore, because it's like, yes, this totally prepares you for university, and it totally prepared us for life, or not for this course, the post-colonial literature course. I wouldn't be nearly as well read or educated as I am today. And yeah, if nothing else, it's like the recommendation: read 1984 before you go off into the world. There, that alone was worth the price of admission, right? But the even long before we had that discussion in class towards the end of the year, yeah, all that we talked about, all that we dealt with in terms of African literature and culture, that was so worth the price of admission, right? Far more worth, far more benefit than the effort expended. So yeah, altogether, I'd say if you haven't, I would encourage people to read just any kind of post-colonial literature you can get your hands on, also indigenous literature, because we did have one book in that class, the book Half Breed. It's written by a Métis woman and talking about, yeah, what it was like to live in Canada as a Métis woman. Um, Kind of skipped over that book because it was late in the year, and I was doing what lazy students do and just sort of prioritizing. It's like, oh, well, I got to work on this, got to work on this. Yeah, and reading fell through the cracks, and I regret that. But I felt wonderful about reading Thompson Highway when I got to university, because it's like, wow. Reading from a non-Western perspective. In fact, these should be included in any classics section of literature, right? Not just because it's a break from reading from a bunch of white guys and a few women, but the perspectives and their appreciation of history from a rather different point of view. It is absolutely essential. If you're going to be educating youth to live in the world as it is today, they need to know. They need to see the other side of everything, because it does astound me still how pervasive just racist attitudes, sort of casually racist is how I would qualify them, because yeah, virulent racism is very much at play right now, and well, always has been. Um, yeah, but yeah, the level of casual racism and assumptions and ignorance that I've seen, and this includes people I consider friends, and unfortunately, that attitude is, yeah, it's pervasive. It's still there. I see it all the time. Thank God for the internet, right? So, for those who, yes, would like to educate themselves and not uh, fall prey to a lot of very imperialist assumptions that are still very much with us, right? Including um, for anyone living today in Canada, the United States, or any of the Americas, Australia, right? We are all settler colonies, just like Kenya was, just like South Africa is. Um, and yeah, we are people who are living on land that we stole, and we benefit from that. And yeah, we like to tell ourselves a lot of things there, saying that, oh, well, it wasn't that bad. Oh, contact was inevitable. Oh, this, oh, that. And it's like, dude, no. If there's one thing that two world wars taught us, and the Holocaust, and many attempted genocides since then, it's that our history mirrors that. That happened here by the hands of the people we call our ancestors, right? And yeah, one can always say, well, my family wasn't involved in that and so forth, but it's like, yeah, maybe not, but they came here as so-called pioneers. Even if they were fleeing the potato famine, the enclosure movement, which is very much the story of my family's background. Yeah, it's like they were coming to land that was stolen and given to them, gifted to them, because it had been yanked away from those who were living on it since time immemorial. And we don't talk about that. We don't acknowledge that. And, well, modern day acknowledgments, like we acknowledge that we're on the land of the traditional lands of these people. It's like, well, that's a step, but what are we going to do about it, right? We acknowledge our occupation. Now let's maybe do something about the fact that we're still occupying it and benefiting from that. While, yeah, its custodians since time immemorial are forced to live in poverty and neglect and abuse and, yeah, and violence at the hands of our own governments there. And, yeah, I don't want to get into this too much there. Point is, reading books like this is a very good way of deconstructing the mentality that allows that to go on. And as my wife, who is a federal toponymist, right, in charge of place names, and she's indigenous herself, she's very well versed in, the cultural and heritage naming traditions, etc. And, yeah, she knows firsthand what it's like dealing with a bunch of just, pardon my language, stupid fucking rednecks who are so angry and violent when it comes to, do we rename this place? In fact, well, we're not even renaming it. We're restoring traditional indigenous names. The reaction that gets, it's, oh, it is so infuriating, really, to see people think and act that way. So, yeah, it is very important to expose people to really just, a big dose of historical truth. And it can be depressing. It is depressing. It is. It can be challenging. But yes, it applies. And it's something we need to deal with there. If you are a white person, a person of privilege of European extraction who's living today in just anywhere in the world, really, whether it's a stolen continent or whether you're in your ancestral homeland, if you're living on European soil. Yeah, it's like history has benefited, Europeans have benefited from conquest and enslavement, and that is a tradition that hasn't gone away. So, as I said one time when someone was saying, oh, well, this all happened in the past, I was like, the legacy remains. And as I come to learn since, it's like not only does the legacy remain, but the very behavior is still happening right here at home. So yes, uh, getting really getting an exposure to cultures beyond your own, that has been one of the most beneficial things of my life. It was so informative, so educational, and it's, yeah, I credit it with, being the person I am today. Someone who is, well, thoughtful. I will credit myself with that, if nothing else, right? At least thoughtful and able to appreciate and really think on these things and try to, try to figure out what do we do about it now? How do we move forward, right? And that's something everyone in this world needs to do, and it will come up at one point or another. So I hope this has convinced at least a few people to read these books and to, yes, really expose themselves to narratives that are outside the mainstream. And in fact, it will encourage themselves and other people to bring those narratives into the mainstream, right? So that we don't have this, what the victors wrote in terms of history, or rather just the pillagers and thieves wrote versus what everyone else wrote, right? Let's get that in the mainstream. Okay, that is me done. And I apologize for not including a beer review there. I don't have any beer in the house right now, but I am enjoying a nice Shiraz because cooking up a pot roast for my wife and I, and yeah, a good Shiraz pairs really well with a spicy jerk beef. Oh, can't tell you. So it's an Australian one. What's it called? Fuck. Yeah. And it's an Australian Shiraz for the record there, and yeah, I recommend that too. Jerk beef and red wine, and throw in some grilled vegetables in there too, with a little blue cheese sauce. Oh my god, it's heaven. Ugh. I can, if anyone wants to ask in the comments, I can provide the actual recipe for that. Jerk sauce is available, and if you can't find it, here's how you make it. I'll tell you. Okay, have a good day, and I'll be back again with some other reviews. Most likely, oh yes, the Regeneration trilogy. I definitely want to talk about that. It's very relevant and it's quite poignant and educational to me today. Um, and some other works of science fiction. I know I got a few left in the tank there. Okay, have a good one.